I don't often review animated movies on this channel because, for obvious reasons, there aren't many horror animated movies, at least in the mainstream consciousness. There are some, but generally speaking, horror tends to be confined, for the most part at least, to live action. Then, of course, you have the even more subtle subgenre of animated game-related movies. Now, there are some. Again, you've got like some of the Halo movies, there are animated ones, live-action ones, generally straight to DVD, and then you've got something like this, and anyone who is a gamer will probably recognise the name at least, even if you haven't played it. Dead Space. Dead Space Downfall, in particular, is the name of this movie. This is a prequel to the games, and one of the reasons why I chose to review this one on this relatively rare kind of review, which I generally wouldn't do, is because I wanted to review this film from 2 points of view. One is as a standalone horror animated movie, irrelevant of the game, to see if it can stand on its own, and also, and this is the interesting point, I have never played any of the games. I own multiple Dead Space games, but I've just never got around to playing them. It's definitely the kind of thing that appeals to me. I love horror. As many of you know, my favourite movie is The Thing. Some very clear inspiration there. I've just never got around to playing them. So that gives me a relatively unique perspective among those who might have seen this movie, because the vast majority of people who have seen it will, of course, have watched it in conjunction with the game, like reading the novelisation of Arkham Knight, for instance, that kind of stuff. Now, this movie, as I said, is a prequel, so of course it's set before the events of the primary game. I believe the main character in the game is Isaac Clarke, if I recall correctly. He's, spoiler alert, but not really, not in this movie. And it follows a different crew, and it has a kind of Japanese style to the visuals, but of course American voiceover. And one of the things that attracted me to it was, one, I didn't know this movie existed, and two, it's such an extreme kind of visual horror that the game has that it naturally lends itself to being exactly the kind of thing that I would love. So I went into it having measured expectations, but also pretty high hopes, because of course I know nothing about the game, or next to nothing, but I know plenty about monsters that I like and horror movies that I like. So putting those two things together is a relatively unique position to be in. So as far as the story, you follow a large vessel, and again, I'm not going to go super into the tech side of things because those who played the games will know far better than I do, but you're following a vessel, a huge vessel, which is attempting to lift a massive artifact off of a planet. And there are certain religious implications of this artifact and religious members of the crew. There are references to a religious governing body back on other planets. Earth, I believe, was referenced. And the majority of the crew are not necessarily tied into this religion, but it's, you know, part of the job, that kind of thing. Kind of like in Alien, for instance. And then things start to go wrong. Members of the crew on the planet itself, where the artifact is, begin to act strangely, kind of go crazy, cut themselves, kill other people, eventually die for sometimes unknown reasons, sometimes suicide, sometimes murder, and then it starts to happen on the ship. So again, very familiar, extremely familiar concept. Plenty of times this has been used in sci-fi, in horror, Alien, even The Thing, although it's not set in space. Andromeda to some degree, stuff like movies that we've looked at before here on the channel. I'm blanking on the name, but it's got Quaid in it and those weird pale creatures. I can't recall the name, but I reviewed it recently. Those kind of ideas are frequently recycled. It's nothing new. So again, could the movie make it interesting rather than just repetitive? For me, yes, it did. As somebody with next to no knowledge of the games, I didn't feel left out. I didn't feel like there was something that I needed to know from the game that was like this massive empty hole. Now, if I had played the game, I have no doubt that I would get even more out of the movie, because that's the idea, that's the point. But that's also the point of the review. Can you watch this without being a gamer, or without playing the games? And I would say, yes, I think you can, because purely as a space animated, almost manga or anime style, not manga, anime style animation with extreme gore, blood, some language. I mean, it is R-rated, so it stands alone. I think it stands alone very well. So as far as the scores, how is it going to compare to traditional horror that we'd look at on the channel? Well, obviously when I score something like an animated movie or a comedy sometimes, that kind of thing, or a horror comedy, they kind of fall under slightly different parameters. Like a comedy, for instance, doesn't tend to rely on the story. That's not really the point. An animated movie, how are you going to score the visuals? You can literally make the visuals whatever you want because you're drawing it and manipulating the image. So you have to take any scores with their pinch of salt, if you will. Put a slight curveball on it compared to a traditional live-action movie. So with that in mind, first of all, I'm going to give the story and the plot a 6. And the reason why I'm going to give it a 6 is because for me it was definitely carried out in the way that I would want the material, if you will, this kind of story to be carried out. Space horror, sci-fi, slightly supernatural implications with some crazy creature effects, plenty of gore, etc. As far as that all goes, it delivers, for sure, especially for an animated movie. As far as knowing all of the references and knowing the full implication of the storyline, well, as I said, it does stand on its own, but it also makes you want to play the game more. So that's a great thing, of course, but by definition, you will get even more out of it if you do play the game. So it's a difficult scenario because the movie wouldn't exist were it not for the game, so it's so intrinsically linked with it that I can't really score it badly for that, but still, I'm going to give it a 6. As far as the characters, the motivations, of course, the casting, etc. on this occasion is mostly just how the characters are written, drawn and voiced. So under those circumstances, I'm going to give it another 6, because none of the characters are too surprising. They are fairly caricatured characters. There's the big soft-spoken guy, the strong female lead, which is becoming more of a cliche now, but a good one, of course. You've got the captain who's trying to do the right thing but kind of fighting amongst himself internally. They're fairly expected things across the board, so it's not really trying to reinvent the wheel. It's a fan movie, in effect, for those who love the game, so of course not. As far as the visuals go, though, I have a ton of respect for animation. I love the style of animation in this one. I love the gore. There are far too few animated movies in this kind of genre, because if you think about it, there aren't that many at all. At least not well-known ones that weren't just straight to DVD like this was. So I'm actually going to give it an 8. I love the craft that goes into it. I love the animation style. I love the gore. It delivers exactly what you want from that. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, the music, I'm going to give it another 6. Above par for sure. I didn't find the sound design incredible, but there's a lot of silent sequences, very quiet sequences. There's a lot of tension, again, like The Thing or like the game from what I've seen of the game. So it ties into what you'd want from it. Nothing to write home about, but good enough, that's for sure. And as far as the rewatchability and entertainment factor, I'm actually going to round it off with another 6, because I think that this is a movie which I can appreciate given my love for horror and monsters and gore, but somebody who is already a fan of the games will probably love it a lot more. So under those circumstances, you'd probably give it maybe an 8, a 9, or even a 10, and I would completely understand that, and I would not argue with it. For me, for instance, I would probably give a 10 out of 10 if there was an animated prequel or sequel to John Carpenter's The Thing. I would love an animated movie based around that, and as far as I'm aware, there isn't one, but I can understand that kind of fandom kicking in for sure. So as a non-fan of the game, who's simply not got around to playing it, as I said, I'm still going to give it a 6. So overall, as a tabulation of all 5 categories put together, although many of the scores probably didn't sound that great, I am actually giving it a 3.2 out of 5. And that's not bad at all, a 6.4 out of 10. Or a 64 out of 100, if you will. So overall, if you have played the games, and if you like the games, and if you haven't seen the movie, definitely do so. I can't recall the runtime, but I don't think it was that long. It's like maybe an hour and 10, hour and 20, something like that. Not too surprisingly for an animated film. If you, as I said, if you are a fan of the game, definitely check it out. If you're not a player of the game like myself, I still enjoyed it. So either way I can recommend it, but definitely more so, for obvious reasons, if you have played and enjoyed the games. But that's it overall for this particular review. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.